Hello and welcome to the Pike County Conservation District's Homeowner Tips to Protect Clean Water webinar. I'm Devan George, the Communications Coordinator here at the district, and I'm joined by Marianna Quartararo, one of our resource conservationists. And we're going to be talking today about how pollution from your own property and from your home can enter into your watershed. Because this is a virtual recorded webinar, if you have any questions, you are welcome to comment on this video and leave them for us, and we'll see them and we'll be happy to answer those questions. And sit back and enjoy the webinar. So I'm going to start off with a little bit of background talking about watersheds. Here we have a really beautiful illustration of a watershed done by Kathy Dodge. And here you can see the exact definition of what a watershed is. It's an area of land where all of the water that falls on that land through precipitation, whether it's rain or snowmelt, will collect in one common point. So here you can see the outline is the dotted line around the edge of the watershed, and it follows pretty much the ridge line of the mountains that surround our watershed. And then all of that water that's coming out of those rain clouds is collecting on the ground and either going one of two places. It can either go over the surface of the land in a process that I love the name of. It's called surface runoff. It's exactly what it sounds like. The water runs off the land and collects in those common points. And that means that it can go into smaller creeks, and then those creeks will flow into larger and larger bodies of water that make up the watershed. The other place that water can go when it falls on the ground is down into the groundwater. And that's a process called infiltration, which is another nicely named, easy to remember process. So here you can see some of the water going down into the ground. And the ground doesn't actually look like stacked cement blocks like it does in this picture, but it does flow down into the ground and becomes groundwater. And groundwater is an integral part of the watershed, because the water can move through the ground and move to that common point, but also it can be held underground and accessed by us. The majority of drinking water in Pike County comes from groundwater, so it's a really important part of our watershed. And then down at the lower right hand of the screen, you can see the common point, which in this example is a river. It could be a lake or a pond. It can be any number of different large water bodies. So here in this watershed, we can see we have a small town, we have some houses, we have a farm. Just like most watersheds, there's people living in it. Do you know if you live in a watershed? Spoiler alert, you do. Everyone lives in a watershed. Anyone standing anywhere on Earth is standing in a watershed. Because wherever you are, water has to flow somewhere, and it has to flow to a common point because of the topography of the earth. So your town, your home, your farm, whatever of these things in this picture you have, you are in a watershed. So when the water falls on the ground, there's a couple, when it goes into runoff, it can carry a lot of different things with it. And maybe you've seen collected trash along the side of the road because it's been carried there by stormwater. So that is a type of pollution. First, we're going to talk about point source pollution. Another perfectly named process is point source pollution because you can point to it. You can say, that's where the pollution's coming from. I can see it. It's right there. And then we also have another type of pollution, which is more common, called non-point source pollution. So non-point source pollution is a type of pollution that comes from many diverse areas in a watershed. And it's carried through a watershed through that stormwater. And when it runs through a town or it runs off of a home and off of a property, it can be accelerated a lot of different ways throughout the watershed. So things that you put in your own yard, think about the last time it rained near your home. Did you see water coursing down your driveway or down a road, that's stormwater runoff picking up non-point source pollutants throughout the watershed. So something that accelerates non-point source pollution and accelerates stormwater are impervious surfaces. And an impervious surface is a surface that water cannot filter through. So that's things like roads, parking lots, driveways, rooftops. All of these things are places where we could put non-point source pollutants and have that stormwater pick up those pollutants and accelerate over the land, collecting all those pollutants in your one county point. As you can see here in the right-hand picture, there's also cases where impervious surfaces collect all of the water over a larger area, like a parking lot, and concentrate it down into coming out of one pipe into a water body. And that can cause a lot of, it can stir up the water, it can increase the severity and the frequency of floods, and it can cause the displacement and destruction of habitat in that water. Also, water that's spread out over a parking lot, instead of going down into the ground and replenishing our groundwater, it's now being directly run off into the river. So the water doesn't have a chance to infiltrate down into the groundwater. So when stormwater is running off of impervious surfaces, there's a lot of things that it could pick up. So here we have a list of some of the things that it could pick up as it's running over these impervious surfaces. Excess fertilizers, herbicides, insecticides. If you use herbicides, insecticides, fertilizers on your garden, it's always very important to follow the instructions on what you are supposed to, how much you're supposed to be putting on and how you're supposed to be using it. Oil, grease, toxic chemicals, things coming off of cars, things coming out of garages, things dumped out of kitchens, anything like that. It could be picking up sediment from construction sites, crop and forest lands, and eroding stream banks. So places where there aren't a lot of plants to hold the dirt in place or other things to hold the dirt in place, it's very easy for stormwater runoff to pick up dirt and bring it into a river. Also salt from our roads, agriculture, and acid mine drainage. So in the winter, we put a lot of salt onto our roads so that we don't slip and slide in on our sidewalks. And all of that's getting picked up because it's just sitting up there on those impervious surfaces. And then bacteria and nutrients can come from livestock and pet waste, and also faulty septic systems. Septic systems can be a major source of non-point source pollution. So here we have some images of non-point source pollution. You can see the very top one to the top left, sediment. If you've ever seen a river after a storm and the water looks like chocolate milk, that's all sediment in there. And that can cause, and it might seem a little counterintuitive because you might be thinking, you know, it's dirt and it's in water. That's all natural stuff. But when there's an excessive amount of dirt in the water is when it becomes a problem. It blocks sunlight from coming into the water. And we all know some creatures that need sunlight, right? Some plants down there in the river need the sunlight to live. And you really affect that habitat when you take a major source of food away for those plants. In the next picture, in the top middle, you can see some trash and lawn debris caught on a grate that was over a stormwater drain. So we're very thankful that that stormwater drain was there. You can't obviously see bacteria up there in the top right, but you can see that the creek may contain raw sewage, and that causes a lot of bacteria and nutrients. And that not only changes the habitat of what can live in there, it also changes whether or not humans can be in that water, because it can be dangerous to humans. And then as we see there on the bottom left, we see some oils collecting around a storm drain. I think that might be one of the things that probably sprang to your mind first. I know it does for me, the visual of oil running into a storm drain. And a lot of storm drains directly drain into water sources without being filtered. So it's very important to be thinking about where the stormwater drain is going if you're going to be pouring something out near a stormwater drain. And then here in the middle bottom picture, you can see because of nutrient buildup, there's a lot of algae on the top of this pond. And then of course we have just more trash, more litter that's collected in a spot where the stormwater has brought it all to one location. So now that we know about these non-point source pollutants and we realize that these are things that we're putting onto our property, let's talk about some ways that we can help to minimize the non-point source pollutants we're putting onto our property, and some ways that we can help slow down stormwater and mitigate it from going so quickly over impervious surfaces and keep it on our properties and on pervious surfaces. So the very first thing we're going to talk about is rain barrels. Rain barrels are a great way to collect the water that's coming off of your home, off of your roof, which is an impervious surface. You might have thought to yourself when I said that was an impervious surface that, you know, I was going to say you should get rid of your roof. I'm not going to say that. Definitely keep your roof. I support roofs. So when you have your downspout coming off of your roof and off of your gutters, you can direct it into one of these rain barrels. And here we have a diagram of the essential parts of a rain barrel. There's a lot of different ways that you can make them. You can make a rain barrel, you can buy a rain barrel, and they're a great way to disconnect that stormwater runoff from the process of collecting in your watershed in one common point and to reconnect it to groundwater. So making sure that it's not just going off of an impervious surface to, say, another impervious surface, your driveway, and then skipping groundwater and plants altogether. Some of the benefits of rain barrels are that they'll save you money on your water bill. If you're using the stormwater for plants and for other purposes around your lawn, maybe to water your lawn, it definitely means you're taking less water out of the system. It obviously helps reduce stormwater runoff, as I've been saying, and it reduces the amount of water carrying pollutants into our waterways. It's pure enough for planting, so as long as you don't have asbestos on your roof, it doesn't have any additives that are found often in tap water, and it's just rainwater, so it's perfect for plants. And you can paint them, and you can do whatever you want with them. You can build it yourself, and it's completely customizable lawn art. So however you want to make your rain barrel look is completely up to you. So some of the other benefits of rain barrels, right? This is a very long list. It's very exciting how many benefits there are to rain barrels. You can save up to 1,300 gallons of tap water annually, again, saving money. And only a ½ inch of rain can fill a 50 to 55 gallon rain barrel. So you don't have to get a lot of rain to start seeing the benefits. It cleans the soil of salt buildup. If you previously used tap water to water your plants or water your lawn. And if you're in an area that sees drought, it can really relieve pressure on those water sources because 30 to 40% of residential water use is used on lawns to make sure your lawns are staying green. So this is a great way to give yourself more water to water your lawn or water your garden. And it's an emergency non-potable water source in case you have a power outage or anything like that. And it's a teaching tool. Whenever someone comes over to your home or you have kids around, you can always teach what the rain barrel does and why that's important now that you know. You can use it for a lot of different purposes besides watering your lawn and your garden. You can water indoor plants with it. You can use it to wash your car, anything that you might use a hose for. So where are you going to get a rain barrel? You can buy one, 100% pre-made at most garden stores, even garden stores around here. I just spoke to someone at Home Depot yesterday, the Home Depot in Homesdale, to make sure that they had them, and they have them there, as well as many local sources. So you can just buy one pre-made if you'd like, but if you'd like to make one yourself, that is also very much an option. There are a lot of DIY rain barrel videos and instructions online, and you can use a storage can, a garbage can, Or I know a lot of rain barrels are made donated from industry, pickle companies, container compliance, things like that, things where the barrels are no longer good enough for industry. They're perfect for rain barrels. And also then you're recycling the barrel from a source where it might have been thrown away. So some things to consider when you're thinking about building a rain barrel. As I said before, do not use it if your roof has asbestos, if you have shingles or roofing that has asbestos. You definitely need a cover because of mosquito and algae. Mosquito laying their eggs and algae possibly coming onto the surface of the water. You can attach a hose if you want to irrigate your garden. It's a really great slow dispersal irrigation guide. It needs to be elevated off the ground just slightly. And you can connect it to really multiple barrels. So you can connect to a lot of different barrels and multiply your catchment. You can buy rain barrel hardware kits. So if you would like to get a recycled barrel but don't want to do too much of the hunting around for the other parts, you can purchase rain barrel hardware kits. And right now, when we're all home and doing work in our yards, it's a great DIY project for your yard. This is very important. The water is not suitable for drinking. And be careful when you're planting edible plants and watering it with the rain barrel water. It's not meant to be a rain source or a drinking water source. It's just meant to be a place to catch rainwater. And make sure that you empty it before winter comes so that you don't have a frozen and then broken barrel. And you might want to clean out the screen in the barrel periodically because it is water running over an impervious surface. And as I said before, it can collect a lot of different things and bring them into that barrel. And if you're worried about roof contaminants, when you first set up the rain barrel, your very first portion that's collected in the bottom, you might want to just drain off and not use for anything. You want to just discard it in case you're worried about anything coming off your roof that very first time. And if you have high rain periods coming through your area, you want to empty it more frequently so that it doesn't overflow and you don't have, backup issues with your downspout. And it can be multifunctional. I know people who have created their own rain barrels and made them also into flower pots and had a lot of different uses for them. And it's a really great way to both help the planet and you can be really creative and you can have a lot of fun with it. And it can be a great at-home DIY project. So the next thing that we're going to talk about are rain gardens. Rain barrels and rain gardens, that's what we're talking about today. So what is a rain garden? It's a garden designed specifically to improve water quality, which is really important. Why is it important? 70% of pollution in streams, rivers, and lakes comes from stormwater runoff. So the water that we're collecting in a rain garden is really helping to mitigate that amount of stormwater runoff that's getting into our streams, rivers, and lakes, and cut down on the amount of things that they're bringing into the streams, rivers, and lakes. Because if you cut down on the amount of water flowing into the water source, you're going to cut down on the amount of things that it carries with it. And rain gardens allow approximately 30% more water to soak down into the ground and become part of the groundwater. So here we have a really nice illustration of how a rain garden works. It's not just a regular garden, it's a special garden. In case you're thinking, I already have a garden, I'm good. So a rain garden is a little bit different. And here in the upper left-hand corner of this illustration, you can see the rain falling on, again, the impervious surface of the roof, and then coming out of a downspout. And with a rain garden, you're directing your gutter or your downspout directly into the rain garden. So you're taking that really big impervious surface of your roof and you're bringing all of that water specifically down to a place where it will help infiltrate into the groundwater. So here we can see the plants that we have in our rain garden in this one, and we encourage you very much to plant native plants. Native plants are especially adapted to the conditions of wherever you are because they started there. And they'll additionally attract more birds, butterflies, pollinators because they will have a good relationship with other native species. And here we can see we planted plants that have a deep root system. The deep roots help the water to infiltrate down into the ground because it creates more systems of infiltration down into the ground. And then over here in the lower right-hand corner of the picture, you can see another very important part of the rain garden is the berm at the outer side. The berm holds the water in the garden, especially during heavy rains. So because water can move so quickly through soil and through the ground, you don't want that water coming out of your gutter and just flowing over or through your garden. And then if you didn't have the berm, flowing downhill on the other side and just leaving your garden and creating more stormwater runoff. So that berm is really important because it holds that rain in the garden and allows it time to infiltrate down into the ground. You also want to make sure that you're planting vegetation that can handle having, I always love this expression, having wet feet, having roots that can handle being damp for a while, because if you have that berm and you're holding that rainwater there, it's going to have wet feet on the roots of the plants. So just like rain barrels, there's many benefits to rain gardens. As you said, flood mitigation. So having your gutter go right into the soil and drain and infiltrating down into the groundwater, you're really mitigating any kind of flooding that you might have on your property, which also reduces mosquitoes on your property because mosquitoes lay their eggs in pools of standing water. So if you're taking out a lot of those pools of standing water, you're really getting rid of a lot of mosquitoes, which is a very exciting reason to have a rain garden. You're also improving the water quality. So as that water is coming off of your roof and coming down onto the ground and down into the soil of your rain garden, it's filtering that water as it infiltrates down into the ground because it has to trickle through so much soil. It's really improving the water quality. Also, when you plant plants in a place where you usually get a lot of flowing water, the roots of the plant will hold that soil in place, which reduces the amount of erosion. So as water flows over a regular lawn or even a place where there's dirt, it can pick up a lot of that dirt and pull it away from the ground. And soon you have, as you can see in the picture to the right, a small river running through your lawn where it was just a lawn before. But the roots of those plants in your rain garden will hold that soil in place. It also helps to conserve water because you're not using water from a hose in order to water the garden. It adds wildlife habitat. Once you have a garden, it immediately adds food and habitat resources for insects and pollinators, birds, small mammals. It creates a great opportunity for wildlife to have a place to live as well. And as I said, it supports pollinators. Having more plants that are pollinator friendly allows them a greater food source. And it can increase your property value. If your property has less standing water and doesn't have an erosion problem, instead has a very beautiful garden, it can obviously increase your property value. So a very important part of creating a rain garden is where you're picking the location of the garden. You want to select a spot in your yard that is often wet and where stormwater flows, but you don't want an area that ponds because that indicates that the area has very poor drainage. So you want a spot that collects a lot of water but doesn't hold it after rain. That's not a great place for you to have your garden. So usually rain gardens are located at the end of a roof gutter or drain spout. I tried to say downspout too, or downspout, as a buffer between the lawn and the street. So if you're like me, your house probably has gutters that drain directly into the street, and then the water flows straight down the street, which, as I said before, is just taking the water off of one impervious surface, your roof, and transferring it directly onto another impervious surface, your driveway or the road. So if you're able to put your rain garden in between your home and the road, it'll directly stop that water from going from one impervious surface to another and give it time to infiltrate down into the groundwater. Although it should be at least 10 feet away from foundation because you don't want it holding water close to your foundation of your home. That's never a good thing. and you want it to be in full to partial sun exposure. Having at least a little bit of sunlight on your garden will help the garden to dry out a little bit, so it's not holding water for too long, and it can help obviously with your plants. Most plants need full to partial sun anyway. The other really important consideration with a rain garden is the depth of your garden. The typical rain garden is between 6 to 8 inches deep, but it's also proportionate to the surface being drained to be sure that the water soaks back into the ground instead of pooling. So you want to pick a depth that is proportional to how much water you're getting in the area that you're planting it. As I said on the last slide, you want to pick an area that's damp but doesn't pool. And if an area is very close to pooling and you dig your garden, you might end up having it pool more than it was before because you've lowered the level of the ground. And also very important, don't add a liner. Most gardens have garden liners when you're creating a garden from scratch, but that completely defeats the purpose of the water infiltrating down into the soil. And as you can see in this picture here on the right-hand side, this garden has a liner, and so the water is overflowing out onto the other side of the garden. Some other important considerations when you're making a rain garden is not to place it directly over your septic system. It's just not a very good combo. You want to make sure that you keep up with the maintenance of the garden. It's not a completely self-sustaining garden entirely. You want to cut back on foliage in the spring, and you want to make sure that you're providing shelter for birds and overwintering cocoons and insects so that you're providing that great habitat that we talked about, but you're not leaving it completely. You should cut it back. And you want to make sure that you build it to the correct proportions to avoid long-term standing water. And there we have some dimensions. Your water should drain within 12 to 24 hours. So if you're 3 days out from a storm and you're still seeing a pool of water out there in your garden, you might want to take a look at what's going on. And 6 inches of standing water is the most that you want. Otherwise, you're going to drown your plants. And as I've said previously on other slides, also that standing water there will create an opportunity for mosquito breeding, which is not something any of us want in our lawn. When you're choosing plants for your rain garden, make sure you're choosing plants based on the need for light and moisture. Because you're going to have a lot of moisture in that garden, it's important to take into consideration what the plants you're putting in there need and what they can tolerate. You have to pick plants that are able to sustain inundation and dry periods. So if you're not watering this garden outside of rain periods, it has to be able to sustain at least 24 hours in 6-inch ponding water. And that's a very important consideration when you're picking plants, so that's something you definitely want to look for. And as I said previously, you want to pick native plants. They live longer, and they're more tolerant of local weather and soil conditions. So whether you're having a lot of rain or not a lot of rain, it's still going to be a normal type of weather for your area, and native plants are going to be more likely to survive and thrive in that kind of weather. And they also provide more stability because they have longer root systems because they're more tolerant of the soil conditions. So these are some of the ways that you can mitigate stormwater runoff, and this is one of my favorite ways to mitigate stormwater runoff. So if you're thinking about having a rain garden, you want to make sure that you're creating a healthy garden in order to have your healthiest possible lake. So I'm going to hand it over to Marianna Quartararo, one of our resource conservationists here at the district, and she's going to tell you about how taking care of a garden well can equal taking care of your lake.
Hi folks, glad you could all join us now. So now that we know what non-point pollution is and what each of us can do to prevent or minimize it, what can we do to minimize it? So the major sources of non-point source pollution are the improper use of herbicides, pesticides, and fertilizers, which are all things we use on our gardens. And it doesn't matter if it's natural or synthetic products, they all have an impact on the environment, especially to pollinators, bees, and aquatic life. So today I'm going to discuss the cultural practices, which are just good garden practices, to help you grow a more beautiful and productive garden with less impact on plants, insects, wildlife, and waterways, in other words, your lake. It's always easier to prevent a problem than to have to treat its effects. Many problems can be averted by starting with a healthy soil. So what does soil do? Everything in a garden starts with soil. Soil acts as a media for the growth of all kinds of plants. It anchors the plants to the earth via their roots. It helps modify the atmosphere by emitting and absorbing gases such as CO2, nitrogen, methane, and also dust. It also absorbs, holds, filters, and purifies water before it moves into an aquifer. And it helps recycle nutrients, including carbon. So this is just some pretty pictures of healthy gardens. These are actually my own gardens, and I don't use really anything besides just good garden practices to keep it going. So I'm going to start with a little mini soil lesson here, very brief. So if you were to dig a hole, you would see different colors and the composition of the soil as you dig. A typical soil profile contains the following amounts of water, air, and mineral particles: organic matter, consisting of humus, soil, organisms, and roots. And also about 50% of a good soil is also air spaces and water molecules. Good soils also contain about 5% or more organic matter, which is comprised of humus, soil organisms, and roots. So they're all pretty important things to have in your soil. So what are some of the physical properties of soil? There are three of them. They're chemical, physical, and biological. So the physical properties are things like the color. So if you look at soil and it's very dark, that means it's a more organic soil. There's more organic material in that soil, which is a good thing. The texture is the percentage of soil aggregates such as sand, silt, and clay, going from largest to smallest of what your soil is comprised of. The structure is the arrangement of those sand, silt, and clay particles, and that determines the pore spaces in the soil for the amount of air and water that'll be in there, and also the soil depth. Now, the physical properties also determine a soil's ability to grow healthy plants and its capacity for erosion. Soils with more sand and silt erode more easily than a soil that has more clay, which holds water. So, as Devan said earlier, that spot in your yard that may be holding water, that's probably a good idea that it's probably more clay than anything else in that area. So the next property of soil, the chemical properties. So there are many chemical reactions occurring in soil, as in our own bodies. Soil composition and the amount of organic matter determines how effective these processes are. Of these, your soil's pH is most important, as this will determine if your plants will be able to access the nutrients in the soil. A soil test will help you determine your pH and any other nutrient needs. And you can contact Penn Extension for soil and pH testing. The pH scale runs from 1 to 14, with 7 being neutral. Most plants grow best in soils with a pH between 6.5 and 6.8. pH is most important. If the pH is not correct for the plant, the fertilizer is useless. So a lot of people like to just throw fertilizer on plants if they're not doing well, when really it's a matter of the pH. If the pH is not correct, those plants cannot take up any nutrients in the soil, no matter how much you put down. So the next is the biological properties of soil. We all remember that song, the worms crawl in, the worms crawl out. Well, those are the living components of soil. And that's your earthworms, your plant roots, insects, microorganisms, which are those little tiny microscopic insects that you may or may not see, bacteria, fungi, all of those things are in a good, healthy soil. And they also help decompose all organic matter that falls on the ground. So if it wasn't for the decomposers, we would literally be buried in dead material and insects. So Pike County soils tend to be very thin, acidic, and rocky, especially rocky, as most of us know if you've tried to garden. I myself garden with a pickaxe. That's how rocky my area is. Most of a plant's feeder roots are in the top 6 to 12 inches of soil, as this is where they obtain most of their nutrients and water. So you can improve your soil structure and water holding capacity by the addition of a soil amendment. So what exactly is a soil amendment? That could be any kind of composted material that you apply as a mulch or incorporate it into the garden bed before you're going to plant. You could use wood chips, shredded leaves, composted manures if you have them available, or any other organic material which will decompose over time. Think of the forest. The forest is a natural is a good example of how soil improves. The leaves and the herbaceous plants and animals all die, fall to the ground, and in turn they become humus layer in the soil. Those decomposers I spoke about earlier, that's what breaks all of that stuff down. And another example of one of the easiest ways to improve your soil and fertilize the lawn is to just let your clippings lie. So too much of a good thing results in runoff, algae bloom, and excessive vegetation in waterways. So how do we not do that? You're going to test your soil to determine the pH and its nutrient needs. There's no sense in putting fertilizer on something if it doesn't need it. You're going to correct the pH in order for the plants to be able to access the nutrients in the soil. And that could be by the addition of lime or sulfur, depending on which way your pH is. You could add a mulch layer every year so to increase the soil microbes and increase the soil structure and tilth. Cut your grass high. Let those clippings lie. There's a lot of nutrients in that. The nutrients that plant or your grass took up, if you let the clippings lie, they're going to go back into the soil because they're all in those clippings actually. And that's not true that letting clippings lie will increase thatch layer. That's not what thatch layer is in a lawn. Thatch layer is actually caused by too much fertilization and the grass forming dead layer there that prevents water from getting through it. You could use organic lawn fertilizers. Feed in the fall. Don't feed in the spring. If you feed in the spring, you're just feeding the grass that you're going to have to keep cutting. If you feed in the fall, you're feeding the roots, which will give you a better lawn. And that would be, if you use organic fertilizers, that's dependent on soil temperature for microbial action. Vegetable garden, you can incorporate a layer of compost before planting. You could side dress or feed during the season with a fish emulsion every couple of weeks, especially for those heavy feeders like tomatoes and corn. And when applying a fertilizer, herbicide, or pesticides, very important, read and follow all label directions. More is not better. It'll just end up in our waterways as algae bloom or feeding invasive plants that will just clog your waterways. So always read and follow the directions and apply just what is needed according to soil test or to the label directions. So now that we've got an idea as to what soils are and how that works, we're going to talk about diseases, plant diseases, and how we can prevent them. So disease needs 3 things in order to infect a plant. And if you don't have all 3 things, the disease cannot get into the plant. So the first thing would be you need to have a pathogen. The disease itself needs to be somewhere, and that could be the fungal spores in the air, or the virus spread by insects, or yourself, or any other way of transmittal. It has to be in sufficient concentration to cause a disease in order to infect the plant. The next is that disease needs a host. Now, most diseases are plant-specific. They don't go to, diseases of tomatoes do not go to corn. They have their own set of diseases. So you're not going to get, they all have their certain little diseases that affects them. And then, of course, you need the right environment, which is conducive to disease transmission. For example, really wet weather is great for spreading fungal diseases, and that could either be through a lot of rain or high humidity or heavy dew. You need an injury for the infection to enter the plant. That could be through pruning wounds or even just breaking a stem or something like that, or even an insect chewing on the leaf. That's an injury, and disease can get into it that way. So we're going to talk about some cultural controls now, those good garden practices that'll help us reduce or eliminate disease problems. So first thing you're going to do is when you're out there looking for plants, you're going to actually look at that plant. You want to buy a nice healthy plant and to start off right. You don't want something that has insects on it or looks like it may have some diseases. So check the plant and look under the leaves and look at the stem, see if there's any insects or any kind of funny looking, a lot of funny looking spots or something of that nature that could indicate some kind of disease going on. No sense in buying a problem and bringing it home and possibly infecting the rest of your stuff. The next is to site your plants appropriately. For example, people love to put hostas in the sun along their driveway. Hostas are not sun plants. They just get stressed, they burn up, and then of course now you have that injury and everything else that just makes disease easier to get into them. So stressed plants they give off scents that insects can detect and they'll be attracted to them also. Use only fully composted materials. That pathogens can be present in incomplete compost. Commercial compost, if you buy that, ask them for an analysis. If they've got a nutrient analysis done on the compost, they should be able to provide that for you. It will tell you the nutrients in there, the organic matter, etc. If it's composted correctly, it won't have any pathogens in it or harmful weed seeds and things of that nature. So if you go to someone that does mass compost making like that, you can ask them for an analysis. The other thing you could do is plant disease-resistant varieties. For example, on the left, that's an apple tree. That's an apple leaf, and what's showing on it is cedar apple rust. On the right is what cedar apple rust looks like on the cedar tree. This disease needs 2 plants to complete its life cycle. So it starts on the cedar tree, forms that growth, and then the spores are released from that, and then it infects the apple tree. Now, while that's not a terrible disease as far as what it does weaken the plant over time, which will impact the tree, and it could eventually die if it's impacted several seasons in a row. It also reduces your yield. So in order to prevent that, you could clean up any disease pathogens that may overwinter in plant debris, like those apple leaves or anything else like that. Late blight, I'm sure people remember that from a few years ago. It was a big problem on tomato plants. That's another disease that overwinters in plant debris. So that's a good reason to clean up your vegetable garden at the end of the year. And dispose of them. Do not put them in your compost pile, because if your compost pile does not get hot enough, those pathogens will just overwinter. They won't be killed. So as I said earlier, you're going to apply the correct amount of fertilizers, herbicides, and pesticides. More is not better. I can't say this enough. People just love to put down, well, if a little bit's good, I'll just put down more and the plant will grow even faster. That's not how it works. What you're doing is causing more problems, and it'll run off your land and go into our lakes and streams. Over-fertilized plants are also more susceptible to insect feeding as it becomes more attractive to them. Fertilizers can also burn the roots if you put down too much, making them more susceptible to cold, heat, and drought. So as I said earlier, the runoff of excess applications just run into our waterways. Herbicides and pesticides should be applied at the correct time and only to the affected plant or area. Don't broadcast and spray everything in the area just because you saw one insect on that plant way over in the other garden. Also be aware of combination products. For example, it's common to find fungicide, insecticide products for fruit trees. What they don't tell you is most of those things don't have the same life cycle. Fungicides are applied at a different time than insecticides would be, and also they're applied more frequently. So I would suggest buying just a product. If you need a fungicide, buy a fungicide. If you need an insecticide, buy an insecticide, not a combination product. Pruning, they should be done at the proper time of year, usually late winter to early spring, in order to allow the wounds to heal properly, and there's also less disease pathogens present at that time. Learn how to water properly. Too many people water the foliage, and that's not where the plant needs the water. Direct the water at the root zone. Water it deeply, and that means give it sufficient water that it goes down at least 6 inches or more when you water. You're better off to water deeply and not frequent shallow watering. If you water deeply and then stop and don't water again until you need it, and that would mean looking in the ground, kind of digging around a little bit, see how moist the soil is and how far down, it helps the plant develop a deeper root system, which makes it more drought tolerant and also helps hold the soil in place and prevent erosion. If you just water a little bit every day, those roots are going to stay up to the surface and never really go deep and become well established. And in times of stress or drought, they won't know. They're more likely to die or really suffer because they don't have a deep root system. Plants need approximately 1 inch of water a week, but that depends on weather conditions. As we've had recently a heat wave, they're going to need more than that because they're giving off more water vapor through their growth processes. So they would need more than that. And we really haven't had any rain. So again, it's always best to just check the soil and see how far down that soil is wet. And always remember, you can always add water. You can't take it away. So don't overwater. That's not good either. That just leads to more fungal root problems, fungal diseases on the roots, etc. So they're actually better to err a little bit on the side of less than too much. So now we get into our insects. You have good bugs, bad bugs, and that adage of the only good bug is a dead bug has produced a society that regards most insects with a degree of fear and revulsion. Some are cute, such as our ladybugs, or beautiful as our butterflies, or useful as our pollinators and bees, and the rest are deemed pests, as that spotted lanternfly on the right-hand side, even though it is beautiful. So we have, like I said, we have good bugs and bad bugs, and one of the things that gets a bad rap is our wasps. Everybody considers it a bad bug, but actually that's actually a good pollinator, and they also eat caterpillars. So that's a thing to look at. Lemons are getting a bad reputation. Of the 1 million known species of insects, not more than 1,000, or 1/10 of 1%, cause economic or personal harm. Think about that. Not more than 10,000, about 1%, are even considered occasional or sporadic pests. The majority do not cause any or enough damage to warrant control. So we need to re-examine our fear of insects or low tolerance for any damage that they may do. For example, we all love butterflies, but in order to get a butterfly, you need a caterpillar, and the caterpillar eats foliage of plants. So we have to learn who they are and what they do before we try to get rid of them all. So this brings us to how do we control the insects in our gardens with the least impact to the environment. Here we have some species. We got our butterfly up on the left, emerald ash borer down on the left-hand side of the bottom. That's considered a pest, again, but it's a beautiful insect. And on the right, we have one of those caterpillars eating our plants, but that becomes a beautiful swallowtail butterfly later on. So in order to control insects, manage insects and disease and other pests in our gardens, there's something that's become quite popular lately, and I use it myself. It's called Integrated Pest Management, or IPM. So this incorporates those cultural controls that I spoke about earlier, those good garden practices, mechanical techniques, physical applications, biological controls, and as a last resort, chemical applications, whether it's synthetic or organic, doesn't matter. So some of the principles of IPM are: 1, identification. Know the enemy. Is it a problem? Is it not a problem? Is it something I can live with? Do I need to treat for it? And a good way to know these things is to monitor your landscape. And that requires you to go out and scout for pest and disease. Now, it doesn't have to be anything formal. I scout by taking my beverage of choice, whether it's in the morning with coffee or in the afternoon with wine, and take a walk around the garden. Just kind of look at the plants, see if their color is good, look under some leaves, see if there's any eggs or anything hiding under the leaves, just to see what's going on. The more you know about your plants and how they look when they're healthy, the better you're able to identify immediately when there is a problem. The other is to practice prevention. Stop things before they become a problem. If you get those eggs before they hatch, you've gotten rid of those pests before they even have to do anything else and avoided a big problem. If you see a disease when it first starts and do some things to prevent the spread, again, you're stopping that right in the beginning rather than before it becomes a huge problem and nothing can be done. The other thing is to know your options. Consider the cost and benefits of the control. It is not always, sometimes the best thing to do if something is really bad is to just get rid of the plant, because you can keep treating, and you may never get rid of the problem, and it's of no benefit to either you or the environment. Develop a strategy. Incorporate multiple things to deal with insects or disease. Like I said, prevention. So if I scout and, okay, it looks good, but the next time I see some eggs, so how do I get rid of those eggs, or how do I prevent the disease from going any further than it is? So just keep in mind and different management tools you can use to control the problem. And then evaluate when everything is said and done. How well did that control work? If you apply something and it really didn't work, or just knocked it down a little bit and they came back, how many times are you going to apply that same thing? Maybe you need to evaluate what's going on and look to do something else. So know the enemy, and is it? This is a good couple pictures here. On the left, I have a picture of a walking stick. It's an insect. It's not commonly seen, but they're pretty cool, and I see them frequently on my property. In fact, a couple of days ago, I saw a little baby one walking around. Like I said, they're pretty cool. But is it a pest? Yes, they eat leaves and some vegetation, but they're usually in such small numbers they don't cause a problem. So I just like to watch them, and I leave him alone. He doesn't need to be controlled. They're related to the walking stick is related to grasshoppers, katydids, crickets. They're in that family. On the right-hand side, this is a tussock moth hatch. Now, this picture just shows very little of what there were. On the ground, there were hundreds more of these. And at first, you might freak out. However, this was taken in late September when I saw these. So this tells me it's a late hatch. They're going to eat the leaves, but who cares? Those leaves are going to fall off in a little while. So they're actually kind of helping me clean things up. So I didn't control them either. And they actually become a pretty cool moth. So even if I had them, I really have not noticed much large-scale damage from these insects. So remember those good garden practices I mentioned earlier? Well, they also help with insect and disease control. So cultural controls is going to be starting with healthy plants, incorporate the resistant varieties, include native varieties. A lot of our native plants, they're adapted to where they grow naturally, and they can put up with a lot of insects or diseases or resist them. So they can fare better than some of the other more exotic varieties you may bring in. Proper planting techniques. Learn how to plant your plants. It's always better to plant higher than to bury the stem or whatever into the soil. Crop rotation in the veggie garden. Move around what you plant where, because disease and insects can overwinter in the soils. And if that plant isn't there, remember I said it needs all three things, if that host isn't there, it won't be a problem for the other plants that you will put in their place. Utilize trap crops. Some certain plants will attract insects to them rather than going to the plant you're trying to protect. For instance, I use nasturtiums in my garden because aphids like to go to them. So I'll sacrifice them rather than have the aphids go to the plants like my lettuce and whatever that I really want to keep for myself. Manage your fertility and irrigation. Again, remember, too much is not a good thing, and better to err on the side of less than too much with water. Adjust your planting dates of vegetable crops. A good example of that is the zucchini. If you plant your zucchini early in the season, like most people do, you're going to have a ton of zucchini, but you're also going to be coinciding with the squash vine borer, which lays its eggs in June. And if anyone has ever had that, that will decimate your plant in a very short period of time. If, however, you plant zucchini a month later, you will avoid their life cycle and you won't have to deal with that pest. And you're still going to get tons of zucchini from your neighbors that planted it earlier, so don't worry about not having any zucchini. And last but not least, follow good garden sanitation. I can't stress that enough. If you have disease and insect problems, get that stuff out of the garden and get rid of it at the end of the season, even during the season if it's a really bad infestation. Just get that out, throw it out, burn it, but don't compost it. So another IPM practice are mechanical or physical controls. So that entails creating barriers such as row covers, which is a very lightweight fabric you can put over your veggies to prevents insects from getting in there. If they can't get to the plant, they can't harm the plant. However, you do have to remove them for pollination because bees do need to get in there to pollinate your fruit and vegetables. Trapping, pheromone traps, sticky traps. A good example is that people may know of are those Japanese beetle traps. If you use them, you should put them away from your garden to bring them away from your property rather than where your vegetables and other plants are. So they work very well. There are different pheromone traps for different insects, so you could look into what your problem is and see if there's one available. Hand removal. Nothing works better than just flipping them into a little bucket of soapy water or crushing. I don't know of any insect that has yet developed a resistance to being squished. And it gives a certain satisfaction to the gardener as that is done. Mulching. Mulching retains moisture and helps keep weeds and grass from invading your planting area, and in turn reducing insect havens. If you don't have high weeds and grass, insects love to hang out in those areas and then come into your crops to eat them. One thing I do want to say about controls, fungicides don't cure the problem, such as powdery mildew and other fungal diseases. They prevent it. So if you apply fungicides early on when you first notice it, when you scout it and notice that powdery mildew was starting on one of the plants, you prevent the further spread of it. And it has to be applied according to label directions. It only protects what it covers. But remember, it's not a cure. So if your plant is completely covered in powdery mildew, it does no good to apply a fungicide because it's just too late. Another IPM thing is biological controls, the use of natural enemies of pests to suppress, prevent an outbreak. Insects, pathogens, and weeds have predators that feed upon them or diseases that make them weak and die. The 3 P's, predators, which are your insects, birds, bats, reptiles, amphibians, put things out there to encourage those toads and those garter snakes or whatever to hang out. Give the birds some place to come and nest, and they'll eat those insects for you. Parasitoids. These are small insects that develop on or inside a host insect. Pathogens, which are disease-causing agents. Biological controls, you can actually buy insects that feed on pest insects, although I don't find this really, I find if you have plants that encourage insects to naturally come to your garden, it's better than actually purchasing them, because as soon as that pest is gone, they're just going to leave, or if there's no pest there, they're not going to hang around. So that's really more of a greenhouse. It's much more effective in a greenhouse using biological controls. Provide a diverse habitat that provides food, shelter, and nesting sites for these natural enemies. So here's a good use of a good example of a biological control. If you grow tomatoes, you may have had this in your garden at one time. They will strip a tomato plant in about a day. So they're quite a large caterpillar. They become a hawk moth, I believe, as adults. However, those little white things you see on there are a parasitic wasp that lays its eggs on them, and then in turn, they feed off the caterpillar and he dies. And on the right-hand side, that is what happened to him. I let him stay on because I saw it had all these eggs on him because I wanted more of these parasitic wasps in there. And eventually that's what happened to him. They literally ate him from the inside and he died. I told you not to eat my tomato plants. Gypsy moth. Everybody here knows who the gypsy moth is. And too often we right away want to control and spray as with any infestation at all. Not a good idea because there are some natural viruses and bacteria out there, or funguses, I'm sorry, that attack the gypsy moth. However, they need the right conditions and they need gypsy moth caterpillars to continue. So if you have a light infestation that really isn't defoliating your whole trees, it's best to not treat them and let these things take place. So what happens with the gypsy moth is they become infected with this either virus or bacteria. There's a couple of them out there. And what happens is they die. And that's what happened to the one on the right. Chemical controls. This is our last thing that you should think about as a last resort. And you should use them responsibly. Like I said, either synthetic or natural, doesn't matter. They all have an impact on the environment. There are different classes of pesticides. There's microbial and botanical, such as different strains of Bt, Bacillus thuringiensis, that attack, that control caterpillars. That's all that Bt affects is caterpillars. And I think there's a strain for mosquito larvae also. It is not a broad spectrum that'll impact anything. Neem is another botanical control derived from the neem tree. I believe the roots. It has a couple different properties. It could be used as an insecticide and a fungicide. However, there are different strains of neem depending on how it was processed as to how well it will either control fungal diseases or insects. So you need to look into which one you have. There are horticultural soaps and oils. I really like these. If you're used at the right time, usually when the insect is quite young, they work by smothering. So again, I scouted, I saw these little things, I knew they were a bad insect, so I got out my hort soap or my horticultural oil, sprayed them, and they died. They went no further. There are insect growth regulators, IGRs. What those do is they prevent the insect from developing so it cannot reproduce. That's some of the newer pesticides out there, that's how they work. Then of course you have your minerals and metals, such as your sulfur-based fungicides or copper-based fungicides. And then also, last but not least, are the synthetic chemicals, which would be things like Sevin and things of that nature. They should all, regardless of what it is, they should be used responsibly and as a last resort. Choose the chemicals that have the narrow host range that are safer for the environment and apply only to the problem area. Do not broadcast. Apply at the right time of day, depending on what you're using. Again, no matter if it's natural or not, they usually impact bees and aquatic life, including the naturals. The naturals also affect that, and a lot of people don't realize that. They just think it doesn't impact anything. Most important, read and follow all label directions. Read that label completely before you apply it. If you buy a concentrate, mix it exactly as it says. Again, more is not better. If it says 3 tablespoons to a gallon, that's all you need. You don't need 6. So to use pesticides or herbicides or anything correctly, identify the pest and the best life stage to apply it to be most effective. Most times it's best to apply things when they're very young, when they're in the larval stage or different instars, which is the periods of development for an insect. The younger they are, the easier it is to control them when they're small. Use selective chemicals. As I said earlier, there are different strains of Bt that target select insects. Don't use broad spectrum pesticides because that'll harm your good bugs as well as the ones you're trying to get rid of. And spot treat, most importantly, spot treat only the infested plants. Don't spray. If you only have a pest, if you notice there's only a pest on one tomato plant, only treat that one tomato plant. You don't need to treat all of them. So some simple practices that can result in a beautiful landscape that provides a home to a diversity of plants and wildlife that will keep our waterways clean and provide you with a daily nature show. So you can help our pollinators by planting a pollinator garden that provides food sources, plants for egg and larval stage and overwintering sites, and avoid the use or limit the use of pesticides, herbicides, and fertilizers on your property, no matter what you do. And maybe the little hummingbird will come visit you too. So the next section I'm going to talk about are some native plants, as Devan spoke earlier, of plants that are suited to a rain garden. And as she had said, the rain garden is a garden that plants need to be able to withstand dry periods and wet periods, short periods of wet, and they need to be adapted to those conditions. Not everybody can. And there are different levels of the rain garden of where you could plant, depending on the plant. So they need to be able to withstand brief periods of standing water, yet be able to tolerate periods of dryness. A number of these plants can do well under these conditions. However, our native plants do tend to do best. Native plants also provide great habitat for many beneficial insects. You don't have a rain garden, you can also use these plants to enhance your lake or stream side riparian buffer, or just put them in your regular garden. It doesn't, they're, like I said, they're good for all our pollinators and other insects and birds, etc., that we need to help with our gardens. So, what do we have first? Witch hazel. This is a native plant. It grows in upland or lowland areas. It gets really nice yellow leaves in the autumn, and it actually blooms in late October after the leaves drop. You will see these little yellow thread-like petals on the branches, and it's just a really good native plant. And I believe a couple of caterpillars use this as a larval food plant also. So this is a larger shrub. It goes about, it can go 10, 15 feet. You can easily control it though with pruning if you don't want something that big. Another great native plant is serviceberry, or shadblow as some people call it. Gets really nice white flowers in the spring. It could either be it's usually a multi-stem small, large shrub or small tree. It's one of the first things you'll see in our forest in the spring. If you see white flowers before anything else leaves out in the forest, most likely it's serviceberry. It gets wonderful fall color, and it also gets fruit that the birds love, but you could also, if you beat them to it, you can get the fruit and make some really great jam out of it. Our eastern red cedar, great evergreen. I know the cedar waxwing bird loves those berries on it, and they'll come and eat them up. Great evergreen goes to be about, it can get pretty large, I think about 20, 25 feet, and it's just a really nice evergreen. Viburnums, what would our gardens be? It's like the backbone of our shrub borders, the viburnums. This one is a withered or raisin viburnum. Gets great little flowers in the spring that the pollinators are all over. Beautiful fall color, and the berries are what really, between the fall color, it gets like a burgundy leaf, usually by October, and then the berries go through several different color changes before they finally end up as a really dark blue. They go from pink to a light blue to a dark blue, and you have all of those colors on that shrub at one time. It's really spectacular. In fact, that picture was taken on the right-hand side, was taken on a shrub on my property. Northern spice bush. This is another one you'll see in our forest early spring. It's a small yellow flower that the pollinators go to. It's one of the early flowers out there that helps the pollinators as they also wake up. Likes wet conditions or moist conditions, can get quite large, can go to about 10, 12 feet, and gets red berries on it in the fall. It's also the caterpillar plant for the spice bush butterfly. Bayberry. I think more people should grow this. It's really a great plant. It can tend to sucker. It takes a while to do that. The one on the left that was taken on my property, that is probably about 13 years old at this point. It does need male and female plants to have berries, so the best is to plant 3 of them, and odds are you'll get a female, at least one female in there. And that was what was used to make bearberry candles. It's semi-evergreen, and those leaves will turn a burgundy in the fall, and then if it's a really severe winter, it will drop them, but then it comes right back in the spring. Elderberry. Now, this is something you probably saw along the roads back in the end of June, not that long ago, actually, about the end of June into July, blooming along our roadways. It likes moist conditions. It gets a great white flower on it, and it will get berries that you can make jam out of, or wine, or whatever. And the birds also like to eat it. So it's a great plant. Goes, again, can get quite large, but it takes very well to pruning. So if it gets too big for the space, you could just easily cut it back, and it doesn't care. It'll come right back. Blueberry. Everybody loves blueberries. Up here we have high bush blueberry, which is suited to moist conditions, and low bush blueberry, which likes drier conditions. So whatever you have, you could use either one. On the upper part of your rain garden, you could put the low bush, and then in the bed itself, you can put the high bush. They both produce fruit. Beautiful, beautiful red flame color leaves in the autumn. Good substitute for those, instead of getting those euonymus or what they call that burning bush. This is a much better substitute, and you get fruit. Black chokeberry, very pretty plant. Early spring flowers are white. The pollinators are all over this plant in the early spring. We have some we put in our rain garden here at the office, and everybody was just all over those flowers in the early spring. Later on, you'll get the black berries, and you can make a jam out of them, but I don't think it's all that great. But the birds love it, and they'll eat it up. And this again turns brilliant red in the fall. So again, you get the berries, and you get really nice foliage. Who needs burning bush? Some of the herbaceous perennials that you could put in your rain garden. On the left would be Joe Pyeweed. This can get quite large. There are some varieties now that stay smaller, about 4 foot. It's a great butterfly plant. It blooms shortly. It's going to be blooming in the next couple of weeks. Butterflies will be all over it. And if you happen to go down along the towpath, along the Lackawaxen, you'll actually see it in a section of the river where there's like an island, and it's just beautiful because there's just a couple of 100 feet of Joe Pyeweed blooming. Like I said, it can take wet feet. It likes wet feet, but also can go in drier conditions in average garden soil. On the right is garden phlox. That's the backbone of the summer garden for your home gardens. Likes moisture conditions, so it can take standing water for a little while. So you may want to put this more up on the banks, not necessarily sitting in the water in the bed, but this could be a little bit up on the banks where it'll get good moisture, but not really sit in water for a long time. A lot of different colors, slight fragrance. Also makes a great cut flower. Sneezeweed. Sad name they gave that because it's a beautiful plant. Doesn't make me sneeze. That's starting to bloom now. That's a July, August bloom. Comes in usually reds, yellows, and oranges. Great plant. Likes moisture, so that can go on the bottom of the bed of your rain garden. Goes to be about 3-4 feet. There's a couple of varieties that are a little smaller now, and just a great plant. Pollinators love it also. On your right is bee balm, and everybody loves bee balm. Your hummingbirds, your butterflies, everybody loves bee balm. We love bee balm. Again, that's a plant that can take some moist soil, but not, I wouldn't put it on the bottom of the bed. I would put it up a little bit higher, maybe with the phlox. It's just a great pollinator plant, and a lot of different colors out there. Reds, purple, white, pinks, fuchsia, all kinds of great colors out there now as a beehive. Geranium, this is a true geranium, not those mop flower things you see that they sell as geraniums. Those are not true geraniums. This comes in a variety of flower colors. You can get, usually it's along the pinks, the purples, with white, some blue. Great early flowers. Some of them now bloom for most of the summer, some of the different varieties that are out there. I also, on some of the varieties of foliage will turn red in the fall, depending on what you plant. Black-eyed Susan, everybody knows Black-eyed Susan and loves it. It's a good pollinator plant, good for the butterflies and bees. The birds love to eat the seeds once they're done. The little finches and other birds like to eat the seeds when they're done. So leave them up for the winter so the birds have something to eat too. So that's about all I have. If you have any questions, you could type them in and we'll try to help you out with that. So go out and plant a garden and go out and scout.
Thank you all so much for joining us today. We have a survey that is down in the description of this video. If you would like to fill it out, we would really appreciate it, just to find out how you learned about our program today and what kind of programs you would like to see from us in the future. We do have one more live webinar coming up. It is on August 23rd, and it is all about our drinking water. We're going to have Peter Wolfhorst from Penn State coming to talk to us about how you can test your water, where your water comes from, and why it's so important to keep your water clean. So we'll see you all there, and thank you so much for coming today.